There is a stage in every human life where everything familiar starts to collapse. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. The routines stop holding weight, the excuses stop sounding convincing, and the future that once felt automatic begins to feel uncertain. Most people panic at that stage. They try to restore comfort. They try to return to what used to work. But that is the first misunderstanding. Because collapse is not the end of direction. It is the removal of illusion. What remains after illusion is not clarity. It is raw responsibility. And responsibility is where transformation begins. Not in theory, not in intention, but in repetition under pressure. There is nothing poetic about that stage. It does not feel powerful. It does not feel inspiring. It feels slow, almost invisible. A single decision repeated when there is no emotional support for it. A task completed when there is no urgency forcing it. A discipline held when nothing external demands it. That is where identity is rebuilt. Not in moments of motivation, but in moments where motivation is absent and action still occurs. At first, nothing seems to change. That is the part most people misinterpret. They assume lack of visible progress means lack of progress itself. But real construction is not visible at the beginning. It is structural, and structure always forms before appearance. There is a phase where effort feels disconnected from outcome, where discipline feels like it is being wasted, where consistency feels like it is not producing anything meaningful. That is not failure. That is foundation. And foundation is never seen while it is being built. Only what is built on it is seen later. Most people never reach what they are capable of not because they are incapable, but because they cannot tolerate the silence of early effort. They abandon the process right before it becomes real, because early transformation does not confirm itself. It only tests endurance, and endurance is not emotional. It is mechanical. It is repetition without feedback. There is also a misunderstanding about change itself. Change is often imagined as a moment, a shift, a realization, a turning point. But that is not how it behaves in reality. Change is accumulation that eventually becomes undeniable. Nothing about it is sudden. It only appears sudden when the accumulation is finally large enough to be recognized. Before that point, it is invisible. And invisibility is where most people quit. Not because the path is wrong, but because the path is quiet. There is also a pattern that repeats across almost every outcome in life. People do not fall because of one decision. They fall because of repeated permission. Permission for delay, permission for inconsistency, permission for comfort to override direction. Over time, permission becomes identity, and identity becomes automatic behavior. At that stage, effort is no longer a choice. It is either aligned or resisted by default. That is why transformation always feels difficult in the beginning. Not because the action is complex, but because the identity resists contradiction. Every attempt to change behavior triggers resistance from the existing pattern, and that resistance is not emotional weakness, it is structural inertia, a system continuing its own momentum. To change direction, inertia must be overcome repeatedly, not once. That is the part most people underestimate. They expect one strong decision to override years of repetition. But systems do not respond to intensity, they respond to consistency. Gradually, something begins to shift. Not in a visible way at first, but in tolerance. What once felt difficult becomes less foreign. What once required effort becomes less negotiated. What once needed motivation begins to require none. At that point, discipline is no longer a struggle. It becomes default behavior, and when behavior becomes default, identity follows without resistance. There is no dramatic transformation in that process, no announcement, no external validation, just a slow replacement of one pattern with another. And the difference between those patterns is not intelligence or talent, it is repetition. The most important realization that eventually emerges is simple. Nothing external was ever responsible for direction. Circumstances influence speed, but not structure. Structure is always internal, built in silence, reinforced in repetition, protected through discipline. And slowly, what was once effort becomes nature. Not because the difficulty disappeared, but because resistance was outlasted. There is no final version of this process, no completion point where effort is no longer required. There is only maintenance, continuing what has been built, protecting what has been established. Because without maintenance, Even strong structures weaken over time. And that is the final truth most people overlook. It is not about becoming something once. It is about continuing to be it when nothing forces it. That is where outcomes are actually decided. Not in intensity, but in continuity. Not in moments, but in what survives them. And everything else is just noise around that fact.